right. Good evening, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Next Steps in Literacy Instruction Book Club. We're going to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that ONLIT's work takes place on the traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to and our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. So welcome to our session this evening. We are taking on chapter 6 tonight, which is reading comprehension, which is an interesting one to tackle. And it's our third to last session together. So we're coming to the end here and we're at an interesting time. So we are going to jump right in and we are going to start and work through a little bit of the chapter together. And I'm going to send you off with an interesting task tonight to work through together. And then we'll come back, chat a little bit more, and talk about our prize for this evening, which is Comprehension Knowledge to Practice. It is on my desk all the time. It is fantastic. So this is our prize for this evening. You can check that out. Another great book that I'm reading right now about comprehension is Know Better, Do Better. It's part of the Scholastic series, Know Better, Do Better Comprehension. So that's another great one if you are looking for a little extra reading around comprehension. The Know Better, Do Better, I'll say, is one of those scholastic ones like Seven Mighty Moves and Strive for Five. Super quick, super snappy, easy read. So off to next steps we go. It's been a long day, so hopefully I can get my words out clearly. Welcome to chapter 6, and we're going to start by acknowledging that comprehension is a complicated thing. So there are many elements that play a role in how a reader constructs their understanding of the text. And it's the outcome. What we want the student to understand is shaped by the interaction of what the reader brings to the text, the demands of the text itself, and the nature of the task or the activity. So when we think about the text, we need to be mindful of the demands of the text, which sometimes contain academic language, with vocab and syntax that's different from how we speak in oral conversation. And this can be especially challenging for our multilingual learners, for our French as an additional language students, anyone whose first language has a different syntax than what we've got in English. When we consider the reader, a reader brings personal knowledge and experience to the text, and that includes their decoding ability, their vocab, their biases, their world experiences, their executive functioning, their cognitive processes, things like their interests, their motivation. And then we consider the task for the activity, which is the reason for reading. And the reasons for reading a text are varied. Sometimes it's a self-generated thing. Sometimes it's an assigned task, like at school. Sociocultural context. So all around, all of these three elements fall within this backdrop of the sociocultural context. The reader brings not only school, but also their home experiences, and that all needs to be considered. And each of these elements is worthy of your attention when you're assessing and designing reading comprehension and instruction, whether you're doing that in small groups, whether you're doing that in whole group lessons. Knowing that these elements, the reader, the text, and the task, as well as that overall sociocultural context, that can influence a student's proficiency and provides us as educators with insight into what our students need to understand and do to comprehend. And this is especially important when we're considering how to differentiate for our struggling readers. So our first key takeaway tonight, one of the biggest key takeaways for me, one of the biggest pieces of my own learning around comprehension is distinguishing between comprehension processes and products. And comprehension is an active process that generates a product or an enduring understanding of what is read. The ultimate goal of the reading is the product. So let's dig into that a little bit more. And this is a diagram that's been adapted from the Comprehension Blueprint, and that's with Nancy Hennessy. And this diagram shows us the distinction between comprehension processes and products. So we know that reading comprehension is complex and it's dynamic and it involves many different processes happening moment by moment. We can think of these processes as internal or mental hidden activities, and that an active exchange is happening between what is in the reader's mind, so their background knowledge, their preconceptions, their attitudes, their experiences, and the information in the text itself. And it's this active exchange that helps the reader arrive at this enduring understanding of the text. That's the product, or ultimately the comprehension. So if we look at number 2, cognitive processes, these come into play when the reader is interacting with the text. The words, the sentences that are used by the author with the underlying or implied meaning in the text, and connecting that to their background knowledge and experience. Processes tied to number 3, executive functions, plays a role in comprehension too. So if we think about a reader needing to shift attention depending on the demands of the text, they need to draw on working memory to hold words in memory while the meaning of a sentence is assembled and the words are linked. And then they need to draw on their long-term memory when thinking up previously learned information to help them infer and to plan and to organize and more. And then if we all the way back up to 1, language processes at the top, here we're thinking about language comprehension processes that we saw back in our first session when we looked at Scarborough's reading rope. So included here would be background knowledge, our vocab, our language structures, our syntax, our verbal reasoning, so inferring, for example, knowledge of print and text structures. So all of that leads into our next slide, levels of language processing to comprehend. So let's consider those language processes. When students are reading a text, it means they need to work with language at many different levels. You'll see that students process words, which we're going to discuss in 2 weeks in our next chapter on vocab. They also process at the sentence level. So to comprehend, our students need to work with sentences of varying density and length. They need to consider a variety of sentence structures, complex grammar, and syntax, including cohesive ties and connectives. We're going to talk about those terms in a little bit. Students also need to integrate their background knowledge, that schema of knowledge, as well as their knowledge of text structures. So it's the complicated back and forth between this language processing at these different levels that supports students to generate a product and capture that enduring understanding, that coherent representation of the text. So to reiterate that thought, although individual words serve as the building blocks of meaning, they live within the context of the sentence. Making meaning of text requires not only understanding individual words, but also understanding sentences. We need to consider again that idea that it's not the strategy that should be the focus of our planning and instruction. But again, what is it exactly that we want our students to learn? And which elements of the text may present barriers to achieving that goal. So before we use a text, we need to take a look and we need to think about vocabulary. We need to think about any gaps in background knowledge. We need to think about syntax and connections within and between sentences. And that all needs to be addressed in order for that mental model to be attained. And we see this understanding reflected in our new language curriculum. So we see that sentence up there, students integrate components of word, sentence, and text level comprehension. In addition to the expectations around comprehension strategies in strand B or strand C of our curriculum, you'll also find the B3 continuum, and that maps out those conventions related to syntax that stretch across grades 1 through 9. And if we use that B3 conventions continuum, it's important to use when planning instruction so that we're supporting comprehension. We can't just focus on a comprehension strategy. They're an important part of the picture, but it's a tangled web, and there are many more components to consider for effective instruction. So when we think about those levels of language processing that we saw a moment ago, we're going to hone in on the sentence level. And I'll start by saying that we're just going to scratch the surface here, but we think it would be valuable to go over some sentence constructions that may be difficult for students to understand. So if you find this interesting and you want to learn more, take a look at the recording from the syntax party. And MJ, I did not put that link in the chat in my list of links for tonight, but I know you can find it real quick. So our new curriculum does include, and we talked about it a little earlier, cohesive ties. So we know that we need to think about how sentences layer together and how cohesion is built across sentences. So sometimes texts have more cohesion and the links between sentences are really clear, and other times it isn't as clear. And we need to highlight the structure for our students to support them in carrying that meaning throughout. So We're going to use this paragraph as an example. Take a moment and give it a read through. So thousands of the trees were planted in parks and along the riverbanks. When they bloomed, the trees became clouds of pink blossoms. As the petals drifted down, it was like pink snowfall. The Japanese people loved the cherry trees as their national symbol. Crowds gathered for picnics under the trees. People wrote poems and painted pictures to honor those sakura. Now, you'll notice that the what of the first sentence is the trees. At the end of the paragraph, these trees are named as sakura. A struggling reader here may not have any idea of how those two words are related. There is no sentence in this paragraph that explicitly links those two components, those two concepts. It doesn't say thousands of trees, which are Japanese cherry blossom trees called sakura, were planted in parks. It doesn't give the students that information. Instead, students have to understand the cohesion across the sentences, and they have to carry that thread from sentence to sentence, and this can be challenging. This form of substitution with a different word for the what is an example of anaphora, cohesive ties, or devices. So we said that the what in the first sentence is trees. So it's underlined. Underlined up here is also the different ways that this what is named. Some of these are pronouns. So the trees is replaced with they, but some of the sentences use a different noun phrase, the cherry trees. So we might want to explicitly highlight this structure to our students and help them to carry that meaning across the sentences to support them in understanding the text and to build that mental model of the content that we want them to take away from this paragraph. You may have also noticed that in addition to anaphora, there are complex sentences that could also be challenging. When they bloomed, the trees became clouds of pink blossom. As the petals drifted down, it was like pink snowfall. And just an interesting point from letters training, readers have to persevere in understanding how a text is put together. Students who struggle to comprehend are not as persistent in trying to achieve that coherence as better readers do. They might be used to that mental incoherence as just a matter of fact. So they need modeling and guidance and encouragement to do the work of understanding. All right, I'm going to send you off to do your interactive task and see if I can figure out how to show you that table when we get back. Just a reminder about our group norms. We're all working together, contribute to the conversation, speak up, take up space, and remember that others need space to engage critically with the content, be cognizant of different experiences, and know that growing and learning means that you may shift your positions, revisit your assumptions, and advance your thinking. So we're going to throw a link in the chat to a whole folder. You're going to be put out into breakout rooms. I'm going to say 4 people probably per breakout room would be good, MJ. MJ's going to put the link in the chat, and hopefully you can open it and you can get into that folder. Let me know if I need to change the permissions on it. So when you get in there, you're going to open that up. There is a table in there with a list of things that you're going to look for in each. So let me see if I can just open one of these up and show you. When you go through, your task is along this side here. I can see people coming in. So you're going to open the Google Doc for the group you're in. So don't go ahead and start just yet. I've got an anonymous chinchilla in here with me. You're going to go through and you're going to read that text, and in your group, you're going to do what is listed on the side. So you're going to find a sentence constructed in the passive voice. You're going to highlight it in orange, and you're going to work your way through that way. Okay. So MJ is going to send you off into groups of about 4 people. We're going to give you 15 minutes to go through this. You may not get through all of it. That's okay. We'll talk about it a little bit when you get back. All right, so we're going to go ahead and take a look at that task, and we're going to unpack that a little bit. Not a problem if you didn't get to all of it. There's a lot on the go. The purpose really was just to get you to dig into the text and to look at some pieces that might make comprehension challenging. We're going to go through this all in one slide, and I wanted to make it as big as possible. There's a lot of text. It's really busy, so apologies for that, but we're just going to go through this quickly. There's a lot going on. So when I was considering vocabulary that I'd teach, I looked at words like variation and shifts effects, generate, or consequences. And again, we're going to talk about vocab a lot in 2 weeks, but these are high utility words that students could use across a lot of different content areas. We learned that sentences in the passive voice are harder to understand. So did you notice that the sentence emphasizes that humans have been the main driver of climate change? That sentence might be more direct if it said, human activities have driven climate change. When there's a center embedded syntax, there's more distance between the subject of the sentence, the who or the what, and the what that thing does, the predicate. So in this sentence, where everything is connected separates the sentence. So it would be easier to read without that embedded prepositional cue. So because the earth is a system, changes in one area can influence changes in all others. Here's an example of a sentence with multiple clauses and phrases. So there's a lot going on in this sentence. You'll notice that the sentence has a phrase that tells when, so since 1800s, a clause that tells what, and a clause that tells why. Notice here that in the first sentence, the what is adapting to climate consequences, but this is replaced by the pronoun it in the second sentence. So students have to keep track of what that pronoun is standing for. Some words signal different relationships. So in this sentence, the word so tells us there's a causal relationship between funding for developing countries and adaptation towards a greener economy. Similarly, in this sentence, but shows a contrasting relationship. So it tells us that while adaptation is needed everywhere, there's especially needed for some populations. And finally, where did you plan for a pause and prompt for students to infer? I thought it'd be interesting after reading that climate inaction is vastly more expensive. It'd be interesting to hear students' perspectives on why failing to act would ultimately cost more. So if we taught the vocab word consequences, it might be a nice opportunity here to revisit that word, as well as encouraging students to use that word in their responses. So we really don't expect you to figure this all out at once, but we just wanted to highlight here the importance of looking closely at different texts and thinking about how some of the features, the content, the structures of the text might make it more challenging for students to comprehend. So our second key takeaway for this chapter really connects to this idea of the text as one of those 3 key elements, and how we've made the mistake in the past of doing a lot of reading instruction outside of the text by focusing on strategies. Comprehension strategies are important, but what we've done is we've made the mistake of focusing instruction on the strategies themselves instead of the product, that reading comprehension, right? And the point that the authors are making in the book is that many of us have placed that misguided focus, I did, on teaching comprehension strategies as that gold star method of teaching reading comprehension. The focus on the process as the goal has come at the expense of the actual product, or that enduring understanding, that comprehension itself. The goal is not to learn comprehension strategies. The goal is to use those strategies where and as appropriate to conduct or to construct that meaning. So this is truly a know better, do better situation, right? We were guided by our old language curriculum. We created units around comprehension strategies. We would practice for 4 to 6 weeks. We would try to find books to fit the strategy. We would teach strategies in a silo, and we would create anchor charts, and we would create posters, and it was all just a little contrived. And we were guided really by that misconception that we could teach a skill to automaticity, and then a student could apply it to any text and make that meaning. And research shows us that that's just not the way comprehension works. And we're going to put a link to an article, Rethinking How to Promote Reading Comprehension. And it's a Hugh Katz article. And he uses the analogy of reading comprehension being unlike swimming. So in swimming, once you've learned the skill of swimming, you can swim in any body of water. You can swim in a lake, you can swim in a river, you can swim in a pool. Reading comprehension really does depend on many factors, not the least of which is the reader's background knowledge about the content of the text. And we also know that this is not how proficient readers read. Proficient readers use multiple strategies as they read, and they're monitoring their own comprehension. We don't just pick up a book and decide to only visualize or only make connections as we read. The understanding of the text needs to be the center of our instruction, not the strategy. So in a nutshell, we need to shift away from that idea of what strategy am I focusing on today, this week, this month, whatever it is, and choosing books that fit that strategy. And we need to consider what we want our students to learn from the text. What's that enduring understanding that we want them to take away from the text? How can we plan our instruction to meet that goal? And then what strategies will our students need that are specific to that text? So we need to recenter the text in our instruction. In addition to taking the time to plan for instruction to support the comprehension of the text, there's other evidence-based activities that we can use to support reading comprehension. There's a whole bunch of them in the book. They're divided into two broad categories: monitoring comprehension and sentence comprehension. So I'm going to highlight 3 from each, but you can refer to all of the other ones in your book. So when we think about monitoring comprehension, we're going to teach students to monitor their understanding during the reading by asking, does this make sense? Do I need to slow down? Do I need to reread this? And one of the strategies is connect, correct, collect. And this is a before, during, and after comprehension process. It's an alternative to that KWL chart. And in this activity, teachers are going to lead students through prepared questions to elicit information that relates directly to what the student's going to be reading. So as the teacher here, you're going to pre-read the passage and you're going to ask questions that can be answered by the text. Students need to connect that response, and their responses can be checked against the information from the text for accuracy. And that way they can correct and they can connect and learn that new information. The next one is those WH questions, and a point to remember here, and this one was a big ooh, yeah, remember that for me, is that we sometimes assume that young children know the meaning and understand those WH question words. Before our students can comprehend the meaning of the sentences and answer those complex questions, they need to be able to recognize the different types of information, and they need to and answer the basic questions of the text. So we need to teach those WH words. We need to introduce one new question word at a time, and we need to not rush that process. We need to make sure that our students have that solid understanding before we introduce another word. So generally, we want to start with the who and the what. From there, we can move into the when and the where, and then why would come last. Page 197 has a script for a my turn, your turn approach to teaching this. And then finally, for monitoring comprehension, writing to improve comprehension. Writing really forces our students to formalize what they know, and it builds that understanding of how written language works, and it can improve that sensitivity to the syntax, to the word order, to vocab, and to more complex sentence structures. So when the focus for writing is on improving comprehension, avoid free journal writing. There's a place for it, but not with this comprehension piece. When we look at sentence comprehension, before students can really understand the meaning of paragraphs and entire passages, they need to understand word meaning, and they need to understand that sentence structure or that syntax. And we know that understanding how sentences are composed contributes to efficient processing of written language, which is what is necessary for that overall comprehension. So when we look here, we've got combine it, summarizing, and frame it. So combining, it's a way to provide practice in combining sentences as part of your reading comprehension lesson. So you're going to provide 2 combining word options for younger students to choose from, and a longer list for older students. They're going to choose 2 independent clauses from a reading passage that can be combined to make a complex sentence. You're going to present the 2 sentences, and you're going to model how those 2 sentences can be put together to make one longer sentence. The relationship between the 2 sentences is going to determine the word to choose. So the cat is gray, the cat is small, the cat is gray and small. The cat is cold, the cat is stuck outside in winter, the cat is cold because it is stuck outside in winter. Writing Revolution is a great resource here for sentence combining. Another one of my favorite strategies is but because so. Take a look at that. Summarizing is a complex skill. It requires the ability to categorize and find the main idea. And young students, our little kiddos, are going to initially provide us with a retell instead of a summary. And they are going to include a whole bunch of details right from the reading. And that retell, that's that stepping stone to summarizing. So if our students are including too much information in their summaries, help them to organize their thoughts, or maybe even provide them with a framework to help them to maybe take away, to omit those irrelevant details and to find that main idea. And finally, frame it. Sentence frames outline a subject, so who or what, and a predicate, did what, and they lead our students to expand the thought, the where, the when, the why, and the how. Be intentional with how sentence frames are used. The sentence frame depends on the comprehension learning goal, and these could be used in writing, but they can also be used orally to build oral language foundation. All right, key takeaway number 3, and this one really resonated with me. I come from a French immersion background, but I do see this in all classrooms that I work with. Given that approximately 80% of struggling readers have poor recognition skills, decoding is commonly the focus of instruction in these small groups, even though these students may very likely need direct instruction and comprehension as well. We know that when we see students in small groups, our time is limited and we need to use it wisely. So we tend to focus on or prioritize the weakest areas, which is often that decoding portion, right? Sometimes this is not the case. If we think about all the way back to the first session that we did, we think of this simple view of reading, we keep it at the front of mind. It helps us to differentiate instruction based on where the root difficulty lies. So there's some really great ideas of how to maximize comprehension during group instruction and to ensure adding an aspect of meaning to building comprehension. Pages 173 and 174 in your book. So just basically some ideas are like, if you're using decodables, yes, they serve a specific purpose with regard to building automaticity. There's still room for some simple comprehension there, some basic questions, simple who or what did what type of questions just to check for understanding. Decodables do stay in their lane, but that doesn't mean that we can't take a minute or two to tap comprehension as part of just a short lesson that's already focused on that word recognition piece. Our next key takeaway, so we started talking about decodables, talk a little more. We know that decodables serve a specific purpose and that we're not going to use them, for example, as a rich read aloud. We also know that reading aloud to our students is a great way to support building vocab and background knowledge for reading comprehension until they can read proficiently on their own. Teachers also need to build listening comprehension. Teachers can read to students regularly from more sophisticated texts to help increase the language base needed for strong listening comprehension. So we don't have to wait until our students are proficient decoders to teach reading comprehension. It should happen alongside of that decoding instruction, but it'll happen through listening to reading. So when we're building young students' listening comprehension, we're setting upper limits to where students' reading comprehension may grow once they have that decoding ability to move to those more complex materials. And we can support this with modeling. We can support this with like before, during, and after model, thinking aloud, really making things explicit and supporting practice over time to achieve that independence. It's valuable to have our students engage in a lot of guided discussion, to participate in meaningful talk about the texts that they're hearing. Pages 179 to 181, the authors give us a list of comprehension accomplishments by grade level. So it goes from kindergarten through to grade 3, and it's from the National Reading Council in 1998. And you can use this as a guideline or a reference list. The authors recommend that you use it as an informal assessment of language and comprehension development. So here, when you note a gap, you can plan purposeful and targeted explicit instruction for that child, and then you can monitor their progress. We're also going to throw another podcast link in the chat. A great one that came out, the reading road trip with Clara Maria Florentini on the importance of reading complex texts. And she talks a lot about reading novels with kids. So that's a good one to check out. Okay, if we think back to our words correct per minute, we talked about that 2 weeks ago in fluency. We need to remember that that words correct per minute on that oral reading fluency assessment is highly correlated with reading comprehension. We can screen students with that oral reading fluency, and we can also use, if we're using Acadians in English, we can use the retell, we can use the maze assessment, and we can use that to identify those students for whom the oral reading fluency isn't really indicative of adequate reading comprehension. A lot of the time, those are going to be our kiddos with low language skills, perhaps our multilingual students, students with specific learning disabilities, maybe. There's lots of also informal classroom-based assessments that you might find helpful as you drill down to gain that better understanding of your students' reading comprehension and weaknesses. Page 177 has an introduction to classroom-based assessments. So if we dig a little deeper, the retell measure here provides an indicator of reading comprehension. So right after reading that oral reading, that ORF passage, students are asked to retell all that they can remember. It's a really basic, informal, quick check to determine if students attend to meaning as they read. So retelling is just one way of measuring comprehension, but it's also an instructional method for creating awareness of comprehension, helps with the improving oral language and facilitating the organization of information for recall. Maze is designed to assess comprehension through a multiple choice task that students complete while reading silently. So the first sentence, so we're looking at a passage of like 150 to 400 words. The first sentence is left intact. And afterwards, every seventh word is replaced with 3 optional word choices in parentheses, and only one of the words makes sense. It's the one from the passage, but only one of them makes sense. So unlike retelling, maze is a method used for assessment only. You can also look through informal and diagnostic, right? So we know we can drill down to find specific areas of weakness by doing informal or diagnostic assessments, especially things that are created by the teacher. So teacher-made tasks, page 177. If you're wondering about a student's listening comprehension, read a short passage aloud, and then ask the student informally if they can give us insight about their overall comprehension ability. Listening comprehension does require those solid language skills, the syntax, the vocab, the background knowledge, the verbal reasoning, making connections, all of that, but it doesn't involve decoding. So it's a really great way to determine here if our student understands the oral language. You can use a vocabulary assessment to check a child's background knowledge. We're going to talk about this a little bit more next session, so 2 weeks from now. Question answer tasks with a combination of literal and inferential questions can give a lot of insight. Assessing knowledge of narrative and expository text structures, page 184 if you want more information on that. And then table 6.1 gives us an additional list of assessments that are grouped by purpose. Just to highlight a few things coming up. So if you do want to dig deeper and you do happen to have a PA day on Friday, there will be the ONlit team available for the data-informed teaching session from 9 to 3. There is a parallel session running in French that will be with myself and Annette Pitzpa and Angeline Humber. So those options are available. We also have 2 other great sessions coming up that are highlighted up here. Language block planning with Laura Bross, and the kindergarten drop-in sessions are starting tomorrow with Kate Wynn. So bring it back. This one it comes to the end every time, comes to the end for us, bringing it back to why we assess, and we assess so that we can instruct. We need to remember that the data is meant to be used. It's meant to help us teach to reach, and we come back to this graphic at the end of every session, at the end of every chapter, because, right, Anita Archer tells us the magic is in the instruction. This chapter, they all wrap up with some great stuff, but there's a really great scripted lesson plan for Mrs. Craft's grade 2 class using graphic organizers to create summaries. The lesson really focuses engaging in discourse about the author's messages and themes, and it shows how she supplements her core reading program to achieve this goal. So there's also the bank of activities at the end. So starting on page 190, you'll get that bank of comprehension practice activities available to you. And to wrap it up, because we know that it is so difficult to assess comprehension, let's instead focus on what we know and what the research says about the product, the reading comprehension, and the processes involved in it. So QCAT says, facilitate the conditions in which comprehension can occur. When it comes to this chapter, when it comes to reading comprehension, we want to perhaps focus less on the nitty-gritty of assessment and more on ensuring that the building blocks are in place. We want to ensure that students are able to work with the different layers of language so that they can build that coherent mental model and they can achieve enduring understanding. Above all else, teachers should engage students in discourse and writing about what they have read. And that's from page 181. So that's it for me. MJ is going to let us know who our winner is tonight. So that's it for us tonight. I'm going to see you in 2 weeks, and I will be joining you from Sudbury in 2 weeks. So we'll have a bit of a different view behind me. And we are going to tackle chapter 7, vocabulary. It's our second last. So we have those 2 sessions in October to wrap up our book study. So I wish you a wonderful evening, and I will see you again in 2 weeks.